Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We will get started in just a moment. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jeff Milder. I'm the director of the Accountability Framework Initiative, or the AFI, and we're very glad that you could join us today. Before we dive into the content, I'd like to begin with just a few housekeeping items. First of all, after this webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the recording, as well as the slides and answers to the audience questions. We're not using the chat function today, but we do welcome you to post questions using the Q&A function. You'll see a button for that in your control panel. And also, immediately after the webinar, you'll have the ability to take a very short post-event survey, and we'd really appreciate if you could give us your feedback at that time. You'll also have an opportunity there to subscribe to our newsletter and hear about future webinars, as well as other news from the AFI. Okay, so we're very happy today to be joined by two expert speakers who are going to give us a real inside view into some of the challenges and solutions around responsible sourcing. So with us today, we have Megan Chesney, the Global Sustainable Sourcing Leader from Nestle. Megan, if you want to come on camera and say hi to everyone quickly, that would be welcome. And thank you. And then we have Conal Judd English from Ethica. Welcome to you both. So even though we can't all see one another, it's always nice to know who's in the virtual room. So we're going to begin with a quick poll. And we'd like you to indicate how are you involved in supply chains that pose risks for deforestation and conversion. So the poll will come up here, and please select the choice that best describes your role. Of course, some of us wear multiple hats, and in that case, just feel free to select the choice that best describes the work you do. Okay, so we have our results here. This is great. So we have about 35% of the listeners here work for companies that either produce or source commodities, more of those on the sourcing side. So that's well aligned with the subject of this webinar. And quite a few other folks are involved in advising and supporting companies, or in being part of sustainability initiatives that are focusing on responsible sourcing. So pretty good spread of all the different roles involved in making responsible sourcing a reality. So thanks for that. That was sort of an easy warm up. Now we have one more question for you that may require a little bit more thought. When we think of what it takes for a company to source products responsibly across all of its supply chains and origins, what emerge as the significant challenges to making this a reality? So there's 5 choices here on this poll, and you're welcome to select all that apply. So any of these that you feel is a significant challenge to ethical sourcing, please tick the box. Okay, we'll give you another 10 seconds or so for this one. Okay, so I'm going to read off the results here. Very interesting. So large majority of folks feel that traceability, knowing where products come from in a supply chain, is a significant challenge. More than 3/4 of you said that. Almost as many identified monitoring of deforestation and conversion as a significant challenge. And then a bit fewer, limited availability of certified materials, managing for supplier compliance, and also then lack of incentives for producers or suppliers to produce materials in a way that's free from deforestation or conversion. So certainly a range of challenges, but traceability and monitoring coming out at the very top. So that's good because we'll be hearing quite a bit about those subjects on today's webinar. So wonderful. Thank you for participating in those polls. And now I'd like to share a brief introduction to today's topics before handing over to our speakers. To begin first, a bit more about us. The Accountability Framework Initiative, or the AFI, is a collaborative effort to eliminate deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and human rights abuses from agricultural and forestry supply chains. We're led by a coalition of more than 25 environmental and human rights organizations from around the world. You can see their logos on the screen here. And collectively, our coalition works with companies, we work with civil society, industry associations, and other key stakeholders to support the transition to ethical supply chains worldwide. And one of the main ways that we do this is to offer the accountability framework as a practical roadmap for ethical supply chains. The framework is applicable globally for all agricultural and forestry commodities, and it also addresses all stages of the supply chain, from production all the way through to retail, and provides differentiated guidance for producers and buyers where applicable. I also want to mention that although our focus today is on deforestation and conversion-free sourcing, the framework also addresses human rights as a co-equal piece of ethical supply chains. And our coalition strongly encourages companies to address environmental and human rights risks in an integrated manner. So just to go a bit deeper about the framework does cover the full range of actions that companies typically need to take in order to achieve and demonstrate responsible supply chains. So this begins typically with setting goals, continues through several stages of implementation, and then finally monitoring and reporting. So the framework covers all of this content. It's organized according to 7 company action areas, and these are elaborated across the accountability framework's 12 core principles, as shown in this high-level schematic on the slide. Today, however, we are going to focus on just one piece of this puzzle. We're going to focus on managing supply chains. But if you are interested in some of these other topics, certainly encourage you to visit the AFI website and also stay tuned for other webinars where we will be addressing these other topics. So more specifically today, we are looking at deforestation and conversion-free, or DCF, supply chains. We define a DCF supply chain as commodity production and sourcing that does not cause or contribute to deforestation or conversion. Achieving DCF supply chains generally requires a company to manage for compliance and drive improvement at 3 levels. So the first is the level of product volumes, and this is the focus of today's webinar. This is about ensuring that the actual materials that are in a company's supply chain at any given time are free from deforestation and conversion. Among other reasons, this is important because when it comes to managing for deforestation and conversion risk, product attributes are a primary, sometimes the sole indicator of product acceptability by buyers. And product level compliance is also the focus of certain regulations, such as the new EU deforestation regulation and the Lacey Act. The reason why there's these 2 other levels here, though, is that focusing on product volumes is rarely a recipe for long-term success. That's because product origins can shift over time, new risks and non-compliances can emerge, and also conditions in the vicinity of sourcing areas such as forest encroachment can affect the supply base itself. For these reasons, the accountability framework also addresses company action at 2 additional levels. So the supplier level is about a company engaging with its suppliers to manage for deforestation and conversion risk across their entire business, including for volumes beyond what the buyer purchases in any given year. This helps ensure that the supplier is set up to deliver effective product level control and compliance over time. For instance, if their supply base shifts or expands, or if the materials offered to buyers from different production units, facilities, or shipments may change over time. The final area is the sourcing area level, and this is sometimes referred to as the landscape level. And this involves taking action within the company's main sourcing areas to detect and prevent new commodity-driven deforestation or conversion and help protect forests and ecosystems on the ground. This work is often done in collaboration with other actors, for instance, as part of landscape initiatives. So we won't dig deeper today into the supplier and sourcing area level topics in this webinar, but we do have webinars on these topics coming up in November and January, respectively. So certainly keep those in mind. And now we'll shift over for a deeper dive on the product level focus. Okay, so when we talk about product level compliance, we refer to deforestation and conversion-free DCF volumes. These are raw, processed, or finished products that are not associated with deforestation or conversion after a specified cutoff date. To demonstrate that product volumes or DCF requires two things. First, it requires traceability to a point in the supply chain where DCF status can be assessed. The AFI generally recommends that DCF status be assessed at the level of an entire production unit. And this is the approach often also taken by many certification systems. The second requirement is having valid evidence that no deforestation or conversion occurred in the place of origin after the cutoff date. This assessment should consider all deforestation and conversion within the production unit that occurred since the cutoff date, regardless of how that land is currently used. And that's important because land use can change on a farm. These processes can be very dynamic. For instance, a farmer might plant maize one year and soy the next year. So monitoring based on current land use at the sub-farm level would make traceability and monitoring all that much more difficult, and we don't recommend it. So bearing in mind this general principle about what is required to demonstrate DCF status, there are three main ways that companies can achieve this. The first is to monitor production units, and this can be done either directly by the company sourcing the materials, or it can be done indirectly by obtaining this information from suppliers. If that indirect route is followed, then in that case, the product must be traced and corresponding evidence of DCF status needs to be passed along the supply chain from suppliers to buyers. In order to monitor it, the production unit requires having the boundaries of those production units, typically GPS or a geographic set of coordinates, a polygon, as well as a way to assess and verify whether there is post-cutoff date deforestation or conversion. The second mechanism to demonstrate DCF status is to use certification systems, where volumes are verified as DCF through physical certification. And you can tell if certification is likely to fulfill this requirement in a given case by first looking at the certification standard. Does it prohibit deforestation and conversion after a specified cutoff date? And secondly, looking at the chain of custody model. Does that model link products directly to the site where they were produced through either segregated or identity preserved? Other chain of custody models will not provide that level of assurance. The third way that it may be possible to demonstrate DCF status is by monitoring at the sourcing area. So where companies can trace materials to a sourcing area in which no or negligible deforestation or conversion has occurred since the cutoff date, they can generally consider all volumes sourced from those areas to be DCF. This approach is typically most relevant when sourcing from areas where land use change took place a long time ago and land use is now more or less consolidated. So these three ways to demonstrate DCF status are all, I think, straightforward enough. But in most companies, there's more to it than just demonstrating compliance, because achieving DCF is actually about making changes to the business. And this takes place at the level of the company's policies, systems, and operations. The accountability framework provides guidance on how to establish and implement these types of changes. So examples of those changes that most companies typically do need to make along their journey and that are covered in the framework include, first of all, the development of written DCF policies and commitments. Second, the establishment of internal systems to carry out these policies, including senior leadership oversight, embedding across all the relevant company functions and adequate resourcing. The third is supply chain mapping and traceability, as I've already alluded to. The fourth is systems and policies for procurement. The fifth is systems for supplier management, including ways to engage and support suppliers to help them address performance gaps over time. The sixth is systems to monitor performance. And then the seventh is mechanisms to engage stakeholders and provide remedy where harms have occurred, including post-cutoff date conversion. So in addition to guidance on these topics, the AFI also provides a variety of resources to help company personnel implement these changes. As an example, we're really happy this week to be publishing a new how-to guide, how to write a supplier code aligned with the accountability framework. So we certainly encourage you to check that out if you're interested. Last but not least, a final important element of company action on DCF is transparency. To help make DCF reporting as straightforward as possible, our initiative recently worked with CDP and other partners to help develop a simple and consistent set of DCF reporting elements. And earlier this year, these elements were rolled out as part of the CDP Forest Questionnaire. I know many of your companies already do use CDP. And our coalition also has been advocating for companies to disclose progress according to these metrics. So in a nutshell, we simply recommend one quantitative metric, which is percent DCF, and ask companies to report on that. And then to further disaggregate that to provide one level of additional detail. So for DCF volumes, the ones shown here in the different shades of blue, indicate which of the three methods were used to demonstrate DCF status. And for the materials that are not known to be DCF, indicate whether that's because you don't know where the materials came from, so lack of traceability, or because it's known that there actually is post-cutoff date deforestation or conversion on production units of origin. Complementing this numerical information, companies should also report on engagement and actions being taken at the supplier and sourcing area levels, as well as how the company is addressing any performance gaps toward DCF sourcing. So this is a great way to provide a bit more nuance about what the company is actually doing. Now we have a chance to learn how some of these concepts are being put into practice. So really excited to hear that. And we're going to begin hearing the experience of Nestle. And so I'll turn it over to Megan. Megan, please take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me clearly?
Perfectly.
Awesome. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, and I'm very excited to share actually more about what I've been doing this past 4 years with Nestle, ensuring that we have achieved our no deforestation target for the palm oil that we source. Full disclosure, for palm last year, we have achieved 96% palm oil as deforestation free. So I'm the global sustainable sourcing leader for the palm oil that Nestle sources globally. I'm based in France, but a few months ago I was based in Malaysia. So I've been to the field many times with our palm oil suppliers in Malaysia and in Indonesia. And so our aim really at Nestle, along with our suppliers and our partners, has been to address the deforestation and peat development, the exploitation of the workers and the farmers in our supply chain, as well as ensuring the inclusion of the smallholders in our upstream supply chain. So a quick reminder, in 2010, with the Kit Kat ad actually that came out, Nestle didn't know what was really happening in our supply chain back then. So when this was brought to our attention, Nestle has committed to end deforestation in 2020. At the end of 2020, we only achieved 70% in our palm oil supply chain as deforestation free. It was much harder than we expected. So we had to postpone by 2 years actually this target for us. And so in 2022, cross commodities, we have achieved 99% deforestation free. And for palm, it was 96%. So I guess the key message here for all the companies in this call was really that for Nestle, it took us time. And so the goal for us will be cross commodities to remain at 99 and push for the last percentage moving forward. If you go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to go too much into details into this slide. What I really wanted to share today was the complexity that Nestle is facing when we're talking about supply chains, especially palm oil. Nestle is the biggest food and beverage company of the world. We have over 2,000 brands, and palm oil is in most of our products. So for the palm oil that we source and the engagement we have had with our suppliers, it has been a day-to-day engagement when it comes to responsible sourcing, even more when we're talking about ensuring that our supply chains are deforestation-free. The first step for us has really been to map out where our food's coming from. So traceability was really the first ingredient to make it happen. Between a Nestle factory and a palm oil farmer, there can be up to 15 different intermediaries. So between the farmer, there can be motorbikes, boats, all the way to a mill, to a crusher, to different refineries, to a manufacturer then. So it has been a very long journey for us to first achieve traceability and then put into place the next step solution I'm going to discuss. So if you go to the next slide, I will take you through really the approach we have taken to monitor if deforestation is happening in our supply chain and how we have achieved 96%. So first, how is Nestle using satellite monitoring as a key core tool to monitor what's happening? So next slide again, please. The core elements here I wanted to share with our approach regarding no deforestation. There is 3 core elements that Jeff actually mentioned. First, it's knowing where your ingredients are coming from. So again, traceability was a very long journey for us to not just map out which refineries, which mill, but also which farmer, which concessions our fruits are coming from. So traceability is the first core element for us to check where deforestation might be happening in our supply chain. The second element is also to check from the sky or from the ground if any deforestation has taken place since 2015, which is the cutoff date that Nestle is taking. And in addition to that, our expectations with our suppliers is that there is a satellite monitoring system in place to monitor current as well as future deforestation that might happen. So those are really the 3 core elements regarding Nestle no deforestation definition. So again, it has been a very long journey for us regarding achieving deforestation-free supply chain. What we came to realize is that there was not one size fits all solution, let's say, when it comes to monitoring deforestation in our supply chains. We are sourcing from over 1,700 palm oil mills. It would have been too easy to have one quick fix. So Nestle has adopted this toolkit approach, what we call. Again, it starts with supply chain mapping, traceability being a prerequisite for us. We first decided to focus on the plantations, the big estates in our supply chains. Now we also have access to smaller concession maps, and we also mapped out the smallholders that are supplying us. Certification being a different tool as well. We do recognize the RSPO standard segregated as deforestation free. We have our own satellite monitoring system called Starling that we use to monitor, engage our suppliers, as well as verify the progress that's actually happening on the ground at the plantation level. And finally, we cannot move it away from this, but really the on-the-ground verification. We do sometimes still need to send people on the ground to check the deforestation alerts that are still popping up in our supply chain sometimes. So in the following slide, I will really want to share with you what is our satellite monitoring, what are the challenges we encounter, and where we see future need for better collaboration. So there is different satellite monitoring that exists, Starling being one of them. So this is the one that Nestle has been using since 2016. So Starling is pretty much a collaboration between Airbus, which is a French company, and the Earthworm Foundation, which is based in Switzerland. Those two have decided to collaborate with Nestle, and Nestle is actually the pioneer regarding satellite monitoring across its entire palm oil supply chain. So we are very proud of it, but as you can imagine, it came with many challenges when engaging suppliers first, failures and successes that I'm going to share with you a bit more in details today. So I wanted to show you what actually Starling looks like, what kind of platform we have access to when we talk about satellite monitoring. Here you can see actually Southeast Asia, where most of the palm oil is coming from. 85% of it is coming from Indonesia and Malaysia. So on this map, what you can see here is really all the palm oil mills that Nestle is sourcing from around the world, well, mostly focused in Asia here, that are shown here. So each number is really a mill. So this, at a higher scale, you can see like the aggregation of the majority of our palm oil mills we're sourcing from. And so the way we started this is if you have a location of a mill you're sourcing from, we then use a buffer zone of 50 kilometers around the mill, as we assume that we're probably sourcing from most of the concessions within this buffer zone of 50 kilometers. Thanks. And so here, the next step then, instead of picking up all the deforestation alerts within this buffer zone, we need more granular information to better inform us if it's really in our supply chain or not. So then we had to heavily engage our suppliers to collect actually what we call TTP, traceability to plantation information, to go all the way to the plantation, to go to the smallholder, to know who was really in our supply chain and to know if deforestation was happening or not impacting us. So you can see here on this map, what's the concession maps are actually in purple on the screen, and in red is where deforestation has been happening. So we're getting this kind of information, as I mentioned, directly from the suppliers and sometimes as well from public sources that we are working to verify on the ground with the different stakeholders. And if you go to the next slide, I wanted to give you as well a quick overview of what it means actually. Once we have these maps, we have all these deforestation alerts. What does a company like Nestle do with it? So we're picking up alerts on a daily basis. So what we do is that we rely on a third-party organization called the Orphan Foundation to get monthly reports actually on the alerts, as well as the no deforestation score for each of the palm oil mill that Nestle sources from. We share those reports then with our direct suppliers, and we ask them to investigate what's happening on the ground. Can they collect more traceability to plantation information? Can they confirm if deforestation is really happening? And if it is happening, what do we do together next to address the cases? So here in green, you can see the mills that has been confirmed deforestation free. In yellow is where we have detected alerts, but we need further information to understand what's happening. And in red is where there is absolutely no traceability information or there has been confirmed deforestation. So the key takeaway here is we have been engaging our suppliers for many years now on a monthly basis, and some of them on a weekly basis, to share with them the alerts, to exchange traceability information. It has taken a lot of time, engagement, transparency, and trust building, let's say, with some of them to really be able to achieve this goal. Next slide. Some of the key insights regarding what we have learned with this long-term journey. If you go to the next slide. Thanks. Our data with our satellite monitoring clearly shows us where is the trend happening, where is deforestation happening, especially the majority of it, where the forest is still standing nearby our supply chain, and where it's at risk to be deforested. We know the trends. So in Indonesia, globally, there has been reports lately that are publicly available that shows that the deforestation rate has overall decreased. But we know in some key areas where rainforest is still standing, it's at risk, and it has actually been increasing on the other hand. So this kind of information with the satellite monitoring, with the field verification we have, really help us better target, better engage our suppliers and the relevant stakeholders on the ground to investigate the case and to prevent this from further happening. If you go to the next slide. Again, we are picking up thousands of deforestation alerts on a monthly basis nearby our supply chains. But it is more complex than just palm oil being the one reason for deforestation to happen. The root causes behind deforestation must be really understood to be able to take the right kind of actions on the ground. So know that these images indicate likely cause based on what it is in the area. However, it does not prove the actual cause. So for that, we really need to engage on the ground and better understand with the government and by people what's happening behind. And if you go to the, yeah, thank you. So you can see from these kind of pictures again, we can easily link who is linked actually behind the deforestation. We can see as per the pattern, it's 100-hectare deforestation happening, or if it's a 2 or 3 hectare deforestation happening. So today, the majority of alerts we see in Nestlé supply chains are actually less than a 5-hectare clearance. Thanks. So here I wanted to share with you a bit of an example of a supplier engagement we've had. So this is an example of a company that actually was removed from our supply chain because of deforestation. It was a big concession. Since then, we were able to engage with them. They put a moratorium in place to prevent further deforestation and to develop land actually to recover from the forest that was deforested. And so you can see from this map, there has been no clearance since the moratorium, but there has been nearby clearance actually. The alert at the bottom that you can see shows that there has been at least 500 hectares that has been cleared in an adjacent concessions company. So it's more than just simple verification. It's also about learning the challenges that this kind of company is facing. It means that we need to engage with them and make sure that the land will not be further developed. So 2 key messages here that are very important. It cannot just, if you go back, sorry, to the previous slide, I really wanted to highlight that the importance of a landscape approach. It cannot just be one company engaging this kind of big concessions. It has to be a collective ask. And so again, we can kick these kind of companies out of our supply chain if we foresee deforestation happening or if deforestation has been confirmed. But I believe we should also go there with the eyes open, engage with them, and if there is a need and if there is a will from the supplier to work with us, really engage them on recovery plans if deforestation has been confirmed. You can go to the next slide. The next one again. So I think the 3 lessons I really wanted to share with you today. Lesson number 1, there's been existing systems that actually shows us where and what action is needed today on the ground. We have a lot of data with the different satellite monitoring and all the systems in place. We know where deforestation might take place soon. So we really need to leverage this kind of information to better engage on the ground relevant stakeholders and prevent future deforestation from happening again. Number 2 is that there's not one perfect system that will give us the right information to act on. We really have to triangulate information between the different systems we have. So the land changes ownership. The supply chains are very dynamic. Sometimes the companies can change names. So it's also important to have the kind of information directly coming from the ground, from the suppliers, NGOs, other companies as well to get the right information to act on. And the last lesson I really wanted to share with you is that there is a need for clear messaging coming from companies about the expectations. So suppliers do need to know that companies like Nestlé and the big ones as well are not just going to investigate the big cases each month. It's an ongoing process. It takes time. It also means that they need to take ownership on the no deforestation commitment. I think those were the 3 key lessons I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Super insightful. I think that clearly illustrates there's no substitute for hard work and getting to DCF sourcing, and it's great to see how that's paid off with Nestle, and also that achieving DCF sourcing is not a one-time thing. It requires all of these ongoing processes that I think you've highlighted really well. There were a lot of questions and comments on your presentation, not surprisingly. I'm going to ask you one very brief follow-up clarifying question before we move on to Conal. There is, in this diagram here, the majority of DCF demonstration the 63% comes from traceable to non-very high-risk origins. And the question was how Nestle defines that.
I don't know what has been shared in our CSV report. All the data should be detailed actually in our CSV report. This is really looking at cross commodities. So you can see this, again, for palm last year, it was 96. Cross commodities, the other ones have a higher score than I do. But for meat, pulp and paper, soy and sugar, they have their own risk assessment done with different third parties and what they consider low risk. And everything should be explained regarding the methodology on our websites or the CSV report. I'm the expert for palm oil, so I want to make sure I'm providing the right information here.
Okay, great. So more detail is published and available for those that want to dig in. There are many more questions. Hopefully we'll have time to get to some of those at the end. So if you asked a question, we'll hopefully be able to get to it. I'd like to turn now to Connell to share another perspective, also giving us some more insight into palm oil sourcing.
Thanks, Jeff. Can I check you can hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great stuff. All right. Hi, everybody. Great to be here with you all today. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about the challenges faced by companies working towards VDCF in some highly complex palm oil supply chains. But firstly, just on the next slide, to quickly introduce myself, I'm Connell Judd English. I'm a consultant at Ethica. For those of you who don't know, we are a UK-based sustainability consultancy, and we provide advice and technical support to clients in the private and public sector on sustainable sourcing of forest risk commodities, so including palm oil and soy, but also others, timber, coffee, cocoa, etc. And one of our main core programs of work that I'd really like to highlight on the next slide is the UK Sustainable Commodities Initiative. And this is a government-funded program of work. It's a cross-commodity platform that we facilitate as Ethica to enable cross-sector collaboration on responsible sourcing of commodities, including palm oil and soy and others as well. And through this, we convene companies from right across the UK supply chain, so from point of import right down to retail level, with government and civil society partners as well. Deforestation and conversion are obviously really core areas of focus for us in this work, and that focus is broadening, certainly in recent times, for example, to Scope 3 emissions and social issues, so not just looking at deforestation and conversion in silo. A really important part of this work that we do as a national initiative is outreach and engagement. So we work really closely with a network of national initiatives from across Europe and wider China and India, for example, to align and amplify our impact. What we're seeing more recently is this national initiative platform really acting as enabling environment for those companies that really want to go further and faster. And we're seeing it being used as a jumping off point, if you like, to, for example, the UK Soy Manifesto, which is also facilitated by us at Ethica, which is a group of companies committing to all physical soy coming into the UK being deforestation and conversion free by 2025 at the latest. So a really important development in the soy sector there. But I'm going to be focusing for the rest of this presentation on my role within this initiative, which is more on leading the palm oil work stream of the UK SCI. So that includes our industry-led roundtable that brings together the UK palm oil supply chain to work to develop sustainable practices. So on the next slide, the rest of this presentation really is a collection of learnings, if you like, from a decade or so of support that we've been giving to UK industry and beyond on these issues. I'm trying to give here on this slide a really very broad overview of VDCF in palm from a UK and European perspective. I think it's worth pointing out that in the sustainable palm sector, we tend to talk more about NDPE rather than VDCF, so referring to deforestation, development on peatland and exploitation. So I might use those terms slightly interchangeably. Looking at assurance mechanisms in the sustainable palm sector around deforestation and conversion, they're generally really well established. And I think we've seen that from Megan's brilliant presentation, where she went into that in quite a bit of detail. So I don't think I'll dwell on that too much, but I think the main assurance mechanism that I'd probably highlight is that of certification. So RSPO certification is really key for many, but there are also other options in that area. So ISCC, another voluntary certification scheme. There are also national certification standards in place. So ISPO and MSPO, the national certification schemes for Indonesia and Malaysia, respectively, as I'm sure many of you know. Looking broadly at the state of play in UK and Europe, we know from the most recent European palm oil monitoring report that 93% of palm oil coming into Europe is RSPO certified. That's a figure that includes mass balance certification and credits as well. So not all of that volume will carry assurance on deforestation as, for example, a segregated supplier and identity preserved supply would. But a really significant gap that we're still seeing in this space is in oleochemical and derivative supply chains, so these highly complex supply chains. I think it's worth saying that companies with us on the call today will know all supply chains are complex, but I'm really focusing here on these supply chains where traceability and visibility is really challenging and opaque for companies in this sector. In terms of what I'm talking about here, oleochemicals, chemicals derived from oils, in this case palm oil, often used in home and personal care products, so your shampoos and toothpaste. And why is this such an issue? Well, it's as far as we've seen from the companies we've been engaging with, a really significant gap in for companies in meeting their commitments on sustainable sourcing of palm. And we're also seeing new regulatory drivers coming into play as well. So the EU deforestation regulation, there's due diligence regulation being developed in the UK as well, that's placing new requirements, or will be placing new requirements on companies sourcing these complex products. So just moving on to the next slide, within the UK Sustainable Commodities Initiative and its roundtable that I introduced earlier, we've established an oleochemicals working group to look at this issue in a bit more detail. And try to tackle some of the challenges that this sector is facing. And I've tried to summarize that very broadly on this slide. So very generally, I think challenges in this area, so for companies sourcing these oleochemicals, I think there are three main categories. So one being clarity. There are hundreds of possible palm-derived oleochemicals that a company may be sourcing. Which could have names that don't sound anything like palm, so that's not particularly helpful. I think the word possible is probably the operative word here as well, because they can also be derived from other vegetable oil or animal sources, and that's not always clear in terms of what the feedstock or origin oil is for these oleochemicals. So that's kind of hurdle number one for companies sourcing these products. Secondly, traceability is a really significant issue. These supply chains often have multiple complex processing stages across different sites or even countries, and that really gives way to a lack of visibility through the supply chain back to origin, and a lack of assurance as well. And I think it's really worth noting that I think it was 77% of attendees for this webinar noted traceability back to origin as a challenge they experience. So I think that's particularly pertinent here. In terms of assurance, the final challenge I'd like to highlight, there's a real lack of availability of RSPO segregated volume in this area. That's mainly down to reasons to do with cost and physical practicality of keeping these really complex oleochemicals physically separate. And that's led to quite a strong reliance in a certification sense on RSPO mass balance, which doesn't in all cases provide the level of assurance or traceability that many are really aiming for through their commitments, or may now be required to achieve to comply with regulation. So on the next slide, I wanted to look really briefly at an example. with our oleochemicals working group in the UK that we've convened, we undertook a very brief piece of research. So looking at a small sample of retail products and identifying the most common oleochemical ingredients contained within them. I think worth noting here, glycerin was the most common oleochemical ingredient in this small sample of products. It's an ingredient that you might be familiar with. It's in shampoos and toothpaste and things like that. In terms of what we know about it, it's often palm derived. It's really closely linked to the biodiesel industry as a byproduct of that industry. It can be sourced as RSPO mass balance, as can others. But it really highlights a very strong cross-commodity issue. So this isn't just a palm-specific issue, in that glycerin is also derived from other vegetable oils or other sources. So the first hurdle for companies using this really common oleochemical ingredient is identifying what is this actually derived for? Is it derived from palm oil or something else? And I think that complexity highlights the challenge of achieving VDCF in this sector, because that's kind of the starting point in this sector as opposed to others. So on the next slide, and I think this is my final one, I've spoken a lot, obviously, about the challenges that this sector is facing, but it's really important to note that there's a lot of positive action being taken as well, a lot of progress being made by industry in this space. When we think about what good practice currently looks like in this sector, I think the most important thing that companies can really be doing is engaging with their suppliers and mapping out their supply chain. And with traceability such a challenge, transparency is really critical in this space. I've spoken a lot about availability of certified volumes, so a bit of a reliance on mass balance. But I think the most important thing companies are doing at the moment is working collaboratively. So I've spoken about our oleochemicals working group. There are other industry platforms that are doing really positive things, like the Action for Sustainable Derivatives group. When thinking about how availability of VDCF volumes in this sector can be improved, we're aware of RSPO undertaking a study into enhancing the robustness of the RSPO mass balance supply chain model, which is a positive step. But I'd also really like to emphasize the significant role that national standards, national certification standards could play in this sector as well. We're seeing continued development in these standards, and they definitely have a potential role to play in providing a base level of assurance around deforestation and conversion by some definition, which would be a real step forward for the sector. And that leads me finally onto what could be reasonably possible or practicable for companies in future. And we could see that base level of assurance being developed. We could see a greater availability of certified volumes. But ultimately, I think it's a question that has to be answered through collaborative action. And I think the final point I'd want to make is our role with the UK Sustainable Commodities Initiative is about taking the principles of the AFI and embedding them in everyday practice in industry. I think the framework's core principle 10 is around collaboration, and I think that's most pertinent for this issue, these issues that I've been talking about today. There's a real strong need to collaborate to achieve something at mass market level here. And that's, I think, why the UK SCI is impactful, because it's about collective action right across the supply chain to achieve impact. And I think that's also why it's really important that AFI is convening these conversations as well. But I'll stop there and just say thanks for listening, and very happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks very much. Super interesting view into a particularly challenging slice of commodity sourcing with derivatives. One quick follow-up question for you, focused on the initiatives out of the UK. are there similar initiatives that would be relevant for companies sourcing products into other markets or more broadly?
Yeah, and it's a good question because I've been emphasizing how important collaboration is, and there's a network of national initiatives not only in Europe but globally that we're actively working with on this issue, that convene companies in their respective countries, and I think that's probably the most important way that we can have impact. I mean, when I'm looking at the UK on its own, an incredibly small, almost insignificant market when it comes to palm oil. We use 0.5% of global volumes, but where we can have an impact is in collaborating with other markets, with national initiatives representing those markets, and in companies based in the UK, but also in other countries, using their multinational, their global influence. So applying their policies globally, for example, which is an issue we've seen before. So I think there's a really well-established framework there for companies to act globally. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions that have come in, and we'll field as many of those as we can in the next few minutes. I do want to mention there are quite a few fairly detailed questions about some aspects of the accountability framework and how it relates to the EU deforestation regulation, as well as details such as the scale at which deforestation and conversion should be assessed. We're going to go ahead and answer those in writing. So after the webinar, you can access those answers in the Q&A document. I think that will just be a more efficient use of time and allow you to see those details laid out on paper. So let's go to some questions that would be interesting to discuss in the few minutes we have left. Quite a lot of interest in certification, questions about the role of certification. This is on the mind of a lot of people, especially as they for companies that have been using certification historically, are wondering how that's going to help them meet the EUDR or maybe not, and also where they go with certification in the future. So maybe I'll start by inviting Megan to comment a bit more on Nestle's use of certification, any aspect that you do find relevant, but I think in particular, folks were interested to hear from the RSPO volumes, how those break down in terms of the different chain of custody models, and also how Nestle is viewing the sort of value of continuing to use mass balance, or whether you're looking to move away from mass balance over time.
Very good questions. Many questions in one. Where to start? It's one of the tools we use. As Nestle, again, we have a footprint that's global. Keep in mind, only 20% of the palm oil that's being produced today is RSPO certified. It has been the case for many years. It's not possible to only source RSPO certified palm oil. It's an important tool, and we support it, and we are sourcing RSPO segregated, IP, and mass balance palm oil. Why is it important for us? Because it does actually, it's a standard. So it does set up the bar clearly on what needs to be achieved by a supplier. The RSPO standard is actually being reviewed. It's the second revision. So every 4 years, they're really updating what's happening in terms of sustainability. And so it's always raising the bar. That being said, it's not accessible for everyone, especially for smallholders. The cost is high. It's very hard to meet all the requirements, especially around land titles, the cost. There's annual audits being in place. So in addition, mass balance does push for the changes across the supply chain. Segregation is the only one that actually does meet the requirements to be deforestation free. But sourcing from RSPO mass balance supply chain also means that the mill and the refineries have a commitment, have clear policies in place, with all the social component behind it. So again, RSPO segregated does meet the DCF requirements we have, but it also goes beyond that. And so RSPO has pros and cons, but overall, it's a very important tool in our toolkit, let's say, to have sustainable supply chain going beyond DCF.
Thanks for that answer. And I think it's especially interesting to note that in addition to volume level control, certification can bring other benefits in terms of requirements that might apply at the supplier level, which helps address the sourcing challenge maybe in a more systemic way. So thanks for that. Conal, I would also like to invite you to comment any more about certification if you'd like to. And I think particularly your last slide had me thinking, if I was in the seat of a company officer, which you laid out a few different options for how to address derivatives going forward in terms of RSPO segregated, but also doing area level due diligence. If you were in the seat of a company officer, which of those horses would you bet on? How would you invest your resources to get where you want to get a couple of years from now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think quite specifically to the chemicals and derivatives topic, I think a really significant challenge with mass balance is a practice of 1 ton for 1 ton mass balance that takes place at refiner level, where conventional derivatives can be sold on as mass balance. So it's kind of a different level to, say, mass balance at a mill, where you have particular assurances around legality and origin, for example. So that's a minor technical point on why it's quite a significant issue for the oleochemicals derivatives sector. I think ultimately, just from our engagement with companies on this issue, I think it's a challenge that has to be addressed through a combination of different mechanisms. I think it's quite a cliche of an answer, but there's no silver bullet for this issue, and it's going to be a combination of actions, from certification to supply chain mapping and gradually developing a stronger level of traceability through these supply chains. But ultimately, I think that the base level of assurance that could eventually be provided by national standards in producer countries could have a really important role to play as well. So some important developments for us to keep an eye on, but main message is it's got to be a real combination of mechanisms and a combination of effort as well.
Great, thank you very much. I think it highlights really, I mean, this is not a dull line of work that we're in. It really requires creativity, inventiveness, and context specificity to solve these challenges. So you both have done a great job of highlighting that. I do wish we had more time for discussion. I want to highlight a few questions that we will try to answer in the Q&A that will follow this, because the questions are good and we'd like to be able to give you some feedback on those. So there were a few questions on how companies should be thinking about this whole DCF area relative to targets they may be setting for climate and for nature under SBTI and SBTN. So we'll be providing some more details on that from the standpoint of the accountability framework. There were also some additional questions about traceability and how companies address the fact that supply base almost inevitably shifts over time. So we may see if we can get a written answer from Megan on that to share with you afterwards, as well as on questions about what happens when deforestation is identified and when to engage or exclude suppliers. So certainly a lot more to discuss, but we want to respect everyone's time and end promptly. And let me therefore just share a few concluding points here. Once again, you'll receive an email after this webinar with a link to the recording, the slides, and also the Q&A, which will be ready in a few days. You'll also see a post-event survey pop up on your Zoom after this, and we'd love to have your feedback. You can also use that opportunity to subscribe to our newsletter, and you can stay in touch with us, learn about future webinars on related topics, as well as other news from the AFI. And of course, you're also always welcome to contact us with any questions or queries. And once again, I really want to thank our two speakers, really insightful and wonderful work and experience, and to all of you for taking the time to join us today. So thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.